On Sunday, September 9th, 1984, Dave and Sandy Lutkins sat down for lunch with some friends at a pizza place in the small, tight-knit community of The Dalles, Oregon. Dave looked around at the bustling restaurant, and then he looked over at his wife and smiled. They owned the place. It was a franchise of the Shakey's Pizza Parlor chain, and he and his wife were clearly thrilled to see so many people stopping by to eat after Sunday church services. Business was actually going so well that Dave and Sandy were thinking about opening up another location in nearby Hood River. But it was Dave's day off today, and he didn't want to think about work. Between raising kids and running the restaurant, he didn't get much time to just hang out and catch up with friends. And so Dave turned back to the two friends at the table with he and his wife, and they were a married couple named Dan and Kay, and Dave asked them, how are things going? Now, Dave knew that Dan was very active in local politics, and therefore kind of knew all the latest town gossip. And so really that's what Dave was asking Dan, like, hey, what's going on in town? What have you heard? And so after asking this question, Dave began to eat his macaroni salad, as Dan very enthusiastically began to fill them in on what was happening behind the scenes in the Dalles. There was a debate about tearing down an old school that they had attended as kids, and there were also some plans to renovate a nearby park, but the big news was local officials were still clashing with a religious commune that had recently bought a ranch on the outskirts of town. And the people in this town were complaining that some of these commune members dressed very funny and they smelled weird, like they could be homeless or something. And worse yet, according to the townspeople, this commune had apparently bussed in actual homeless people from around the country and then registered them to vote. And so as Dan was talking about this, he couldn't help himself and just shook his head and said, what would happen if these weirdos from the commune took over? As Dave listened, he thought about his own experience with this commune. He actually didn't have any complaints about them. In fact, sometimes a few of them would venture into town and come to Shakey's to eat, which was great for Dave and Sandy, and they never caused any problems, and they always paid for their food, so really Dave had no complaints. And so Dan continued chatting for a bit longer about the commune and about some other topics around town, and then eventually they all finished eating their lunch, and they stood up and said their goodbyes and went their separate ways. Later that day, Dave was standing behind the cash register inside of their restaurant, counting out the day's profits. And as he did that, suddenly a cramp stabbed at his stomach so hard that he had to bend over. He tried to breathe through the spasm, but it only seemed to get worse, and then also he was hit with a wave of nausea. Dave knew Sandy was outside in the car waiting for him, and so he pushed through the pain and finished at the register, and then he went to the doors, walked outside, locked up behind him, and made his way over to the car. Once he was inside, he told Sandy about this pain he had, and he told her he felt nauseous, and he said, I just gotta get home. And so Dave drove as fast as he could back to their house, trying to keep the nausea at bay, and as soon as they pulled into the driveway, Dave hopped out, ran inside the house, ran into the bathroom, locked it behind him, and then he just began vomiting practically nonstop into the toilet. A minute later, Dave heard Sandy knocking furiously at the door, and Dave grabbed onto the bathroom sink to kind of pull himself back to his feet, and he reached over and unlocked the door. Dave thought his wife was knocking because she was worried about him, but no, as soon as the door opened, she just rushed past Dave and took his spot at the toilet and began retching into the bowl too. Dave figured they must have caught some sort of stomach bug and just needed to rest. But when he tried to walk to their bedroom, he became so dizzy he almost fell over. So he just sat on the ground, waiting for his wife to finish in the bathroom. And as he waited, Dave put a hand to his forehead and felt how hot he was getting. His body became slick with sweat as chills ran down his body, and his stomach began to cramp up again very painfully. And then when Sandy finally emerged, Dave felt nauseous again, and so he rushed back inside and began vomiting. And then every time he was done vomiting, he would have these horrible bouts of diarrhea. And so when Dave came out of the bathroom the second time, he found Sandy lying on the bed. She was pale and there was sweat running down her face, and she started saying something to him, but when she spoke, her words were slurred and unsteady. At this point, Dave was really beginning to worry. It seemed like they both might not just have a stomach bug, that this might be something kind of serious and they might need medical attention. But at the same time, Dave wasn't sure he could even drive them to the hospital with how he was feeling. And so Dave just climbed onto the bed next to his wife, and the two of them just laid there for several hours, hoping that whatever was going on with them might begin to taper off. But after several hours, Dave was still feeling incredibly weak and horrible. And so at this point, Dave decided they couldn't wait any longer to get help. He knew that he and Sandy were now so dehydrated that he was worried they could pass out or something. So Dave got out of the bed and stumbled to the kitchen and called a taxi. 10 minutes later, he and Sandy were in that taxi on the way to the emergency room. After a short ride, Dave walked inside of the emergency department with Sandy leaning on his arm for support. To Dave's surprise, the waiting room was already completely packed. And right away, he spotted a few people who had eaten at his restaurant earlier that day, and all of them looked pale and sweaty just like he and his wife. Dave and Sandy limped over to the check-in counter and nearly bumped into their friend, Dan, who looked even worse than Dave and Sandy. The trio sat together as they waited, but nobody said anything. They all felt too sick to talk. Eventually, Dave and Sandy were admitted to the hospital, and a nurse hooked them up to IV drips to replenish all the fluids they'd lost. Then the doctor explained that the couple was too sick to go home, and they would need to stay overnight for observation, or at least until they figured out what was making them so sick. And so after Dave and Sandy were set up in their room, a doctor said a nurse would come by soon to collect blood and stool samples shortly. The next morning, the doctor returned to Dave and Sandy's hospital room and told them he had their test results. Dave listened intently as she explained that he and Sandy had salmonella poisoning, a bacterial infection that attacks the intestinal tract. And in fact, the doctor said the majority of the other people who had come in the previous day, along with Dave and Sandy, they also had salmonella poisoning. Now, the doctor said they didn't know where the salmonella had come from, but immediately Dave had a bad feeling. He didn't dare say it out loud, not even to Sandy, but secretly, he worried the salmonella poisoning had come from their restaurant. Dave grappled with that horrible thought as he and Sandy were discharged and began to make their way back through the hospital towards the exit. And as they got near the exit, they saw there was still a crowd of patients waiting to be seen, which actually made the waiting room seem even busier than it had been the night before. Dave guided Sandy to the door, feeling very grateful to be getting out of the hospital, but also feeling very guilty that his restaurant might very well be to blame for this outbreak. Later that day, Oregon State epidemiologist Dr. Lawrence Foster picked up the ringing phone on his desk. An epidemiologist is someone who investigates patterns and causes of disease and injury. Dr. Foster was a quiet man with a gentle demeanor who operated extremely well under pressure, responding to emergencies with science and logic. He actually loved the intense work of being an epidemiologist and listened closely as an official on the phone outlined a new breaking case. In the past 24 hours, nearly 20 patients had arrived all at once at a small hospital near the Dalles, Oregon. All of them had been diagnosed with salmonella poisoning, and almost all of them had eaten at a local pizza place right before getting salmonella poisoning. Dr. Foster thanked the official for calling with the update and said he would get right on it. After hanging up the phone, Dr. Foster did not think this was some crazy crisis. Instead, he thought this was a pretty straightforward case of food poisoning, and so now his job was to locate the source of the salmonella bacteria and eliminate it. So he grabbed his car keys and headed for the door. He knew where to start looking. About an hour later, Dr. Foster pulled up to Shakey's Pizza Parlor in the Dalles. It looked like an old-school pizza joint with a large hand-painted sign and Adirondack chairs out front. The restaurant was closed for the day, but the doctor had picked up the keys from Dave Lutkins, one of the owners, on the way over. After opening the door, Dr. Foster stepped inside and slipped on a pair of latex gloves. The first step to pinpointing the exact source of the salmonella outbreak was to gather food samples and then take them back to the lab to be tested. And so that's what Dr. Foster was here to do, get those samples. And then while the food testing was underway, members of Dr. Foster's team would interview the restaurant's employees, while others would talk to the patients at the hospital who had fallen ill. And so Dr. Foster began walking around the empty restaurant, stopping periodically to look closer at table surfaces and kitchen equipment and whatever else he could see. And then eventually he walked over to the large walk-in refrigerator. And when he poked his head inside, He saw there were rows of plastic containers holding the restaurant's salad bar offerings. Fresh veggies, several kinds of lettuce, garnishes, and dressings. And right away, Dr. Foster felt like this very likely could be where the salmonella came from. He knew from experience that the raw ingredients on an open-air salad bar were a very common source of food poisoning. And so Dr. Foster worked his way through the walk-in fridge, carefully plucking out samples of each food item using sanitized tweezers and placing them all in the small plastic containers that he'd brought along. By the time he left the restaurant, Dr. Foster was certain the samples he had taken would crack the case in no time. Later that week, Dave Lutkin sat in a corner booth at Shakey's, dejectedly staring out the window. He and Sandy had been sick for days, but he was feeling better and the delirium had finally gone away. However, coming back to his senses was no picnic. Even though he had deep cleaned and reopened his restaurant and had shut down his salad bar just in case, word was all over the news that their restaurant, Shakey's, had very likely caused the big salmonella outbreak. And so as a result, Dave and his wife had not seen a single customer all day, or all week for that matter. Dave let out a sigh as he thought about all the money they were losing, but even worse than that, 13 of his employees were still sick, and dozens of his regular customers had fallen ill and were still dealing with symptoms. Suddenly, the ring of a telephone pulled Dave away from his negative, spiraling thoughts, and so he rushed to the counter, hopeful whoever was calling was a customer, maybe looking to place a takeout order. And so he brought the receiver to his ear, and the second it was against his ear, he quickly had to pull it away, because on the other line was a man who'd gotten sick after eating at Shakey's, and he was screaming at Dave through the phone, threatening to sue him. And so Dave just sat there listening as this guy accused him of feeding his customers dirty produce. Dave had gotten dozens of calls just like that one, and he was starting to worry that they would never end. Once the yelling man had said his piece and hung up, Dave walked back to the booth, shoulders slumped. Then he turned back to the window and went back to scanning the streets for customers he knew would never come. A week later, Dr. Foster sat in his office with his head in his hands. He'd been so sure that this outbreak of food poisoning was due to contaminated ingredients at Shakey's Pizza that he really hadn't even considered if that wasn't it. It just seemed so likely. But now he knew he was incorrect. That had not been the source, because he'd just gotten word that there were an additional 20 cases of salmonella poisoning from people who ate at 2 other restaurants in town. So Shakey's could not be the only source of the bacteria that was making these people sick. Dr. Foster was confident in his abilities, but he also knew when to admit that he had been wrong. And he definitely underestimated the severity of this salmonella outbreak. It was way bigger than just Shakey's. In fact, he was receiving daily calls from the Dalles emergency room begging him for updates as the number of salmonella cases surged towards 100. And so far, Dr. Foster didn't have any answers. And so he stood up from his chair and began pacing around his office. He couldn't just sit around and wait all day. With all the new cases popping up, maybe his team just needed to expand their investigation. 30 minutes later, Dr. Foster, along with his team, sat around a large table in the conference room. He did his best to stay calm and collected, but truthfully, he was starting to feel nervous. He told his team that all they knew for sure right now was that all these people who got sick had gotten sick after eating at 3 different restaurants, all in the Dalles. And then after saying that, he opened up the floor to discussion. He basically wanted people to come up with more ideas about where the salmonella outbreak could be coming from. And so after going back and forth for a few minutes, kind of rehashing the same details everybody knew, one scientist who'd been quiet during the entire discussion so far suddenly spoke up. He wondered if maybe the salmonella could have somehow entered the town's water supply. If the bacteria was in the water supply, then it kind of made sense that it was now being found in multiple locations. Dr. Foster considered the alarming implications of this possibility. If the salmonella was coming from the water supply, there was no telling how much bigger this outbreak would get. Dr. Foster told the scientists to gather his things. They were going to go to the Dalles to check their water. The next day, Dr. Michael Skeels leaned over a lab bench in his laboratory at the Oregon State Public Health Lab near Portland. Like his colleague, Dr. Foster, Dr. Skeels had been working around the clock to try to figure out the source of the salmonella outbreak in the Dales, examining dozens of samples every day. Dr. Skeels adjusted his tortoiseshell glasses on the bridge of his nose, willing his tired eyes to stay open as he screened yet another petri dish with bacteria grown from a lettuce sample. Unsurprisingly, it seemed to be teeming with salmonella bacteria. But there was something odd about all the bacteria they kept finding. There were 2,500 different strains of salmonella that Dr. Skeels knew of, but they kept finding the exact same very rare strain over and over again. Dr. Skeels reasoned that this meant that all of the salmonella had almost certainly come from one source, but he had no idea what the source could be. Dr. Skeels knew one thing for sure, though. It was not the water supply. His staff had tested the public water samples Dr. Foster's team had collected, and they had found no bacteria in the water. It was totally clean. So the investigation was sort of back to square one. Dr. Skeels sighed as he lifted his head from the lab bench and looked around the room at his exhausted colleagues hunched over their work. He desperately needed more coffee, or even better, a nap, but that wasn't going to happen anytime soon. Because not only was their investigation stalled, the public health crisis in the Dalles was only getting worse. Over the past few days, the number of restaurants involved in salmonella poisonings had increased. Salmonella had now been found in 10 restaurants, and so now a second wave of infections was engulfing the town, and this time it was much bigger than the first. Dozens more people were sick, and more people were arriving at the hospital every hour. The scale of this second outbreak was overwhelming the town. Emergency rooms were struggling to manage the new patients, and all of the hospital beds were full and patients were sleeping in the hallways. And so, of course, the people who were getting sick were lashing out at the only people they could, the doctors and nurses, who were doing their best, but they were having a really hard time keeping up. It was just complete chaos. Dr. Skeels was struggling to keep up too. He was doing his best to manage all of the lab testing while also trying to figure out why this new outbreak was happening. It seemed like the salmonella was showing up everywhere and yet still coming from nowhere. The bacteria kept being found where they expected it to be, mostly in salad bar vegetables like lettuce and cucumbers, but also they found it in items that are rarely contaminated with salmonella, such as salad dressings and coffee creamers. And they still had no idea how so many different foods could be contaminated. It wasn't the water supply, so where was this bacteria coming from? Dr. Skeels waved his tired staff over to him in the middle of the lab. And as they walked over, he took in their bloodshot eyes and their stained lab coats, and he knew he looked just as bad as they did. Dr. Skeels took his glasses off and rubbed his eyes. He told the group that the outbreak was getting way too big for this small staff. If they were going to find the source of this mass poisoning and prevent new cases, they needed help. It was now time for the federal government to step in, which meant they needed to contact the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC for short. His very tired team nodded in agreement, and so Dr. Skeels turned and headed to his office to make the call. A few days later, Dr. Skeels could barely contain his shock as he combed through the CDC's research. The CDC had put its enormous resources to good use, interviewing hundreds of patients as well as their families and friends. They spoke to 325 food handlers who had all worked at the 10 restaurants. They measured salad bar temperatures and investigated food handling practices. They even visited a few farms to inspect the milk and vegetables that these restaurants had used. And they discovered that people who had food that was delivered from these 10 restaurants did not get sick, but the people who actually physically ate inside of those 10 restaurants did get sick. They also discovered that while the blue cheese salad dressing at one of these salad bars was teeming with salmonella, well, the powdered mix that makes that salad dressing contained no salmonella. To Dr. Skeels, these were very revealing discoveries, because it meant that the food in these 10 restaurants was safe when it left the kitchen, like for a takeout order, but then somehow, once it was in the dining areas inside of these restaurants, it became contaminated. But it was hard for Dr. Skeels to even come up with an idea of how that could happen. He wondered, for example, how the powdered salad dressing mix could be clean while it was in storage and then suddenly turned poisonous when the staff prepared it for the salad bar. It just didn't make sense. But then Dr. Skeels had an alarming thought. What if someone was putting the salmonella in the dressing after it was prepared? Or putting the salmonella in the food once it was inside of the dining hall? I mean, if this was done by a person, then it all made sense. Dr. Skeels realized that he was imagining a possibility that seemed too far-fetched to be true. Did someone purposely grow toxic bacteria and then for some reason choose to release it into the community? The name for that was bioterrorism, but the question was, if it really was bioterrorism, which again was very far-fetched, who would want to do that? About a week later, Dr. Skeels sat in the conference room at the Oregon State Public Health Department, along with some of his senior scientists, to hear the latest update from the CDC officials. One of the CDC representatives began with the good news. The salmonella outbreak had finally died down sort of on its own. Thankfully, no one had died, and there hadn't been any new cases for a week. But then Dr. Skeels heard the bad news. They still did not know what, or who, had caused the 2 waves of salmonella cases that sickened an incredible 700 people. But the more they'd learned about these outbreaks, the more everyone seemed to agree with Dr. Skeels. The whole fiasco did seem like a deliberate attack. They just couldn't prove it. The CDC said they were going to continue their investigation, but it seemed like for now, the crisis was over. Dr. Skeels was relieved to return to his usual work, but he felt haunted by the fact that he hadn't solved this mystery. A year later, on October 2nd, 1985, Dr. Skeels pulled his car to the side of a country road outside of the Dalles. His team was already there waiting for him. As he approached the group, Dr. Skeels felt the nerves and anticipation bubbling up all around him. But public health officials were not the only ones on the side of this lonely road. They were surrounded by federal agents carrying semi-automatic weapons and wearing bulletproof vests. This was a raid by federal agents, and Dr. Skeels felt very out of place. Now, this job, being a part of this raid, could not be more different than Dr. Skeels' usual stream of research and meetings, but he reminded himself that they needed him. If this raid was going to be a success, he needed to stay calm and focused and do his job. And so the leadership in charge of the raid finished running through the plan a few more times, and then everybody returned to their respective vehicles. Dr. Skeels drove behind the rest of the 50-person group as they entered through the gates of the 64,000-acre ranch that was the home of the Rajneeshi religious commune. Dr. Skeels headed straight for one unassuming building, search warrant in hand. He was accompanied by a germ warfare expert from Washington, D.C. The instant they stepped inside of that building, Dr. Skeels could not believe what he saw. It was a state-of-the-art medical laboratory that this commune was clearly running. Dr. Skeels walked around inspecting the various experiments and documents that were strewn about. At some point, he found a copy of the anarchist cookbook open to a certain page just laying out on the table. A chill ran down the doctor's spine as he flipped through the instructions on how to make homemade explosives and illegal drugs. Nearby, there was another book that focused on military biological warfare. The literature was fascinating and horrifying, but it was not what he was looking for. Dr. Skeels continued walking through the lab, making his way to a back corner where he found a large walk-in freezer. His eyes went wide as he took in the rows of rare chemicals and bacteria perched along the walls inside of glass vials. He walked to the back of the freezer and he leaned in close to see the contents, and his breath caught in his throat as he read the label closest to him. It said, Salmonella. Dr. Skeels carefully removed the glass vials and placed them in his bag for evidence. The answer to the poisoning of an entire town was right in front of him. Lab tests would prove that the salmonella samples Dr. Skeels collected inside of that lab were an exact match for the strain that was found in the Dalles a year earlier. The Rajneeshis had deliberately planted the salmonella at Shakey's Pizza Parlor and other restaurants in town, hoping to sicken as many people as possible. The Rajneeshis preached that they were leading the way to a new era of free love at their commune. However, they kept on getting into fights with the Wasco County Commission that regulated what they could and could not do at their commune. So the Rajneeshis had decided to just go ahead and take over the commission by installing their own candidates. The Rajneeshi leaders reasoned that if most local residents were too sick to vote, then their candidates could easily win. They used the months before the November vote for a bizarre kind of dress rehearsal. Initially, commune members had put salmonella in spray bottles and doused doors and other public places in the Dalles, but no one had gotten sick. So, in early September, they tried spraying salad bars in 10 local restaurants. For good measure, they also sprayed other items like the salad dressings and coffee creamers. And this attack did exactly what the commune leaders hoped for. Hundreds of people got sick. But amazingly, this was really only the start of the Rajneeshis' plot to win this election. They were going to poison people's food with salmonella, but also they did intend to poison the Dalles water supply with salmonella, and one of their members did get access to the water supply, but for some unknown reason, the plan failed, and so no one got sick from the water, and therefore not enough people got sick, and so enough people turned out to vote, and so the cult's candidates lost the election, despite having bussed in all those extra homeless people to vote for them. It just wasn't enough. And so after this raid, the Rajneeshis' leader, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, and his deputy, Ma Anand Sheela, were both arrested. There was not enough evidence to prove Bhagwan was behind the attack. Instead, it seemed like Sheela had sort of acted on her own. And so she was tried and found guilty for the salmonella attack, and eventually served 29 months in prison before being deported to West Germany. As for the commune compound, it was shut down and the land was sold. Despite being vindicated, Dave and Sandy Lutkin's business, the pizza parlor, never recovered, and so they had to close it down. However, out of this, they were able to start a catering business instead, where they had much more control over who had access to their food. To this day, the Rajneeshi salad bar poisoning remains the single largest bioterrorism attack in United States history. On a cold day in January of 2017, a 26-year-old man named William Hargrove paced anxiously back and forth inside of his tiny bedroom. Will was nervous because he was about to take the biggest chance of his life. He was about to ask a woman, who he had only known for a few weeks, if she would marry him. Will looked around his bedroom and he saw there was dirty clothes coming out of his hamper and there was fast food trash all over the ground. And so he knew this was not the ideal location to ask someone to marry him, but he also knew he was running out of time. The woman he wanted to propose to, who was sitting right behind him on his bed, was about to head back to Russia where she lived in just a few hours. And so Will finally stopped pacing, he turned to face this woman on the bed, who was just sitting there silently, and Will was about to say something, but then he chickened out and just kept on pacing. To that point, Will's life had been pretty boring and lonely. He worked a low-paying job as a mechanic, and he lived in this bedroom. This was his apartment, this one room, which was being rented to him by a married couple who owned the house it was in. And this house was in a small city in the US state of Oregon. Will didn't really have any friends, and he didn't really have any meaningful hobbies. All he really had was his intense love of science fiction and fantasy. He would lose himself for hours watching movies about outer space and strange, distant alien planets and magic, and then often, after he would watch these movies, he would walk into the forest near his house, and he would just kind of wander around daydreaming about these movies, and he would pretend he was the hero from these movies. And suddenly in his mind, Will would become a sorcerer with great powers, or a brilliant scientist who went back in time to save the world. But as much as Will loved daydreaming and fantasizing, what he really wanted was a wife and kids. And so recently, he had joined an international dating website, and it was through that website that he connected with 26-year-old Anna Repkina from Russia, who was the woman sitting on the bed behind him. And now, if Will could just muster the courage to pop the question to her, he was confident she would say yes, and he could finally start his real life with Anna. Anna, who had blonde hair and striking blue eyes, was a bit of a dreamer like Will. For example, she fundamentally believed that there was a soulmate somewhere in the world for everyone. However, to that point in her life, she had not found her soulmate. Instead, she had been through one bad breakup after another. But a few weeks earlier, when a short, stocky, bald guy with a bushy goatee, Will, had reached out to her on an international dating website and invited her to America to visit him, she believed it was fate that they were being brought together, and so Will had to be her soulmate. Will finally stopped pacing and turned again to face Anna, who was now reading a book on the edge of the bed. And Will, who was terrified at this point, took a deep breath and then reached into his pocket and pulled out a jewelry box. Inside of it was a beautiful emerald ring that was situated on a white gold band. And so Will took a step towards Anna, he dropped down to a knee, and he held out the jewelry box and he opened it up. At first, Anna didn't know what Will was doing and was kind of confused, but when she saw the ring and saw him on his knee, she knew what was happening, and she began trembling with excitement. And then Will, he pulled the ring out of its holder and he slipped it onto Anna's finger, and he asked her if she would marry him. And Anna, she began crying tears of joy and shouted, "Yes." Later that day, Anna would fly back home to Russia, but as soon as she landed, she began getting her affairs in order to go right back to Oregon to live with Will permanently. And 2 months later, in March of 2017, Anna was touching back down at the Oregon airport, and then right near the baggage claim, she had her big reunion with Will. That evening, when Anna and Will drove from the airport to Will's place, they parked the car, they got out, they grabbed Anna's luggage, they went up the front steps, and when Will unlocked the front door to go inside of the house to make their way up to his bedroom apartment, as soon as the door swung open, there was a woman standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, staring out at both of them. This woman was 34-year-old Michelle Chavez, and she and her husband were the married couple who rented the bedroom apartment to Will. Michelle had dark hair and piercing eyes, and even when she was being pleasant, she could be very intimidating. And right now, it was obvious she was not trying to be pleasant. And so Anna, who sensed something was wrong here, kind of awkwardly said hi to Michelle, but Michelle, she just glared at Anna and said nothing, and then looked from Anna to Will and said, "Will, I need to talk to you." And then before Will could say anything, Michelle grabbed his arm and began dragging him through the house to the back. And as Will is kind of stumbling along after Michelle, he tried to be calm and told Anna, "Just go ahead and take your stuff up to the room. I'll be up there in a minute." And so Anna, she's very confused about what's happening here. She does not understand this dynamic at all, but she began taking her suitcases and marching over to the side of the house where Will's bedroom was. And as she did this, she could hear on the other side of the house, Michelle really yelling at Will, but Anna couldn't make out what Michelle was actually saying. And so at some point, when Anna was now inside of Will's bedroom, just kind of waiting, Will finally did come into the bedroom with his head hung down low, and Anna could just tell that, obviously he's just been yelled at, he looks defeated, and so Anna's trying to make eye contact with him, and finally, Will looks up at Anna, and Anna says, "Hey, what's going on? Why was she so upset? What's happening here?" And in a quiet, trembling voice, Will would tell Anna that Michelle and her husband had just told him that they can't live here anymore. They have to move out. Anna couldn't believe this. She had just flown across the world to be here with Will, and now they don't have a place to live. But she could tell, obviously, Will is really upset about this too. And so instead of just being mad at him, she said, "What's going on? Why is she kicking us out?" And at first, Will kind of acted like he didn't really know, but then eventually, when Anna kept asking for more information, he would tell her that Michelle sort of had a crush on him, and when she saw Anna moving in with Will, she became really jealous and told them to leave. When Anna brought up the fact that Michelle was married, Will said, "I know, she's married, the crush hasn't gone anywhere, but she still feels really jealous." Anna was obviously really upset about this situation, but after Will had explained what's going on with Michelle, Anna wasn't mad at Michelle. She actually felt kind of bad for her. It was sort of pathetic that this married woman was acting the way she was. And so Anna actually figured that really this is probably for the best, that we should get away from Michelle. And within a few days, Anna and Will had moved out of Michelle's place and found a place of their own in a neighboring town. And as soon as they were settled inside of there, it was like relief washed over both of them. And they both became really excited to plan their wedding and think about their future together. A few weeks later, on March 25th, 2017, Anna woke up early and put on her beautiful, simple white wedding dress that she brought from Russia, and then she and Will piled into his car and they headed to the beach. The couple had decided to go with a very simple, intimate outdoor wedding ceremony led by an officiant. An officiant is someone who can legally conduct a wedding. When the couple arrived at the beach, Anna hopped out and immediately began walking over the sand towards the water, and Will stayed back to call the officiant because he didn't see him anywhere. And so when Anna reached the water, she took in the beautiful sights and sounds of the beach, she felt the sun on her face, and she listened to the sound of the waves crashing, and it was like suddenly she realized how lucky she was. I mean, this wedding day was turning out to be perfect, when over the past couple of weeks, she wasn't sure if it was even going to happen. Even though Anna and Will had left Michelle's house and had no contact with her, over the past couple of weeks, Michelle had become a sort of thorn in their side, sending Anna all these really threatening messages, things like demanding that Anna share Will with her, or else she'll do something awful. And so Anna is thinking that Michelle is going to find a way to sabotage their wedding, but here they were on the beach about to get married with no Michelle in sight. And so at some point, Anna looked along the beach and saw a little bit farther along were the two friends that she and Will had invited to be a part of their wedding. And so Anna ran over to them and she hugged them and began chatting with them. And as she's chatting, she looks up and she sees Will coming down onto the beach and he's on his cell phone. And Anna can't tell what he's saying. He's too far away, but it's obvious there's something wrong. And by the time Will actually got up to the group, he had hung up his phone, but it was very obvious he was really upset. And as soon as he reached the group, he would announce to Anna and their friends that the officiant was not going to be able to make it. And so unfortunately, the wedding was off, at least for now. Now, Anna was totally crushed by this, but she could tell Will also was totally crushed by this. And so instead of crying and making Will feel worse, Anna put on a brave face and told Will, "Don't worry about it. We will find another officiant. We'll reschedule this. It will be fine." And so Anna and Will's friends, they said bye and they headed their way. And Anna and Will had a very somber walk along the beach back to their car. But on the drive from the beach back to their apartment, they would stop at a fast food restaurant, McDonald's, and they would get some food. And by the time they had made it back to their apartment, they were laughing about how ridiculous it was that they were eating fast food in their wedding clothes. A couple weeks later, Anna was still in the process of rescheduling their wedding, and she was starting to feel very frustrated with Will. Over the last week or so, Will, instead of helping her with the wedding, was spending much of his time outside of the apartment, pacing around, chain smoking, while talking to someone on the phone. Now, Anna didn't know who he was talking to, but based on how stressed out he seemed, Anna assumed he had to be talking to either Michelle or talking to someone else about Michelle. Regardless, Anna knew this had to, in some way, be connected to Michelle. However, whenever Anna would approach Will and ask him why he was so stressed and whether or not he was still in contact with Michelle, Will would try to change the subject, or he would just clam up and not talk at all. But finally, on April 16th, so 3 weeks after the couple's first failed wedding attempt, Will would approach Anna and ask her very sheepishly if she would come with him on a walk through the woods, because he had something important he wanted to tell her. Now, Anna knew that Will loved walking in these woods. He still went off and daydreamed after his movies. And so she knew that if he's asking her to go out there to talk, that this was going to be a very serious conversation, most likely about Michelle and whatever's going on. And so the couple piled into Will's car and they drove to the parking lot right near the woods. They got out, they hopped on a path, and they began walking into the trees. And for a while, they didn't really talk to each other. They just walked quietly side by side through the woods. But at some point, Will began to slow down and then finally came to a full stop, at which point Anna stopped too, and she turned to face him. And when she did, Will paused for a moment, and then with a shaky voice, told Anna that he felt like they rushed into their relationship and he wanted to call off the engagement. Anna was so caught off guard and heartbroken by what she was hearing that she couldn't say anything. She just stood there in stunned silence and then finally just turned around and stormed off away from Will deeper into the woods until she was out of Will's sight. The next day, when Will woke up, the first thing he did was pick up his phone and text Anna. But Anna didn't write back. And so as Will is laying in bed, he couldn't help but feel this overwhelming sense of regret about the decision he had made the day before. He wanted Anna back. So over the course of the next several hours, Will would send Anna a series of increasingly more desperate sounding text messages, pleading with her to just talk to him, please. But she didn't respond to any of his messages. And so Will decided that the only way he could get Anna back would be if he did something big. So he hopped out of his bed, he grabbed his cigarettes, he went outside, and he began pacing and chain smoking, trying to come up with whatever big idea was going to get Anna back. And at some point, an idea came to him. He would do what he had seen heroes do in several of his favorite science fiction and fantasy movies. He would use time travel to go back in time and get Anna back. Feeling totally energized by this idea, Will ran back inside his apartment, he grabbed another pack of cigarettes, a 6-pack of soda, and then he sat down at his computer and he scoured the internet for any information about how to build a time-traveling machine. And for the next 24 to 48 hours, Will stayed at his computer, chain smoking and drinking sodas, drawing all these sketches of different time machine designs that he found on the internet. But at some point, after 24 to 48 hours, Will realized that no matter how good these sketches were, he lacked 1, the resources, and 2, the knowledge and expertise of how to take this sketch and actually make it into a real physical time machine. And so feeling totally frustrated, Will took a sketchbook and threw it, and then lay down on his bed, feeling somewhat defeated. But as he laid there thinking about Anna, he had another epiphany. In other science fiction and fantasy movies, sometimes the heroes didn't need to use time machines to go back in time, they would use magic. And so suddenly Will decided, oh my goodness, I need to find the right magical spell that will allow me to travel back in time and get Anna. And so once again, he ran back to his computer, continued chain smoking and drinking sodas while scouring the internet looking for the right magical spell that would take him back in time. And several times he communicated with strangers on the internet, telling them that he would sell his soul to them if they could give him the right spell. And then anytime he thought he found the right spell, he would close his eyes and chant the words out loud, and then open his eyes only to realize he was stuck in the present. And so finally, after basically staying awake for 72 hours on this quest to go back in time to get Anna back, Will realized that it was not going to work, and so he gave up. The next morning, on April 19th, so this is 3 days after he broke up with Anna in the woods, Will heard a knock on his front door. And when he opened the door, there were 2 police officers standing there. And when Will asked them, what's going on, they told him that they actually needed his help, and would he mind coming to the station to talk to them. And so Will, he was still totally exhausted from not having slept over the last 3 days, but he of course agreed to go. And when he got to the police station, he was led into a small interview room, and he sat down behind this metal desk in front of the other 2 officers, and he asked them, what can I do for you? And one of the officers eventually asked Will if he had recently eaten at a Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant. That's a fast food restaurant also known as KFC. Will was puzzled and almost wanted to laugh because he couldn't understand how this was important. But when he saw that these 2 officers were not making light of this at all, they were very serious, Will said, yeah, a few days ago I did eat at a KFC. Why does that matter? To understand why it mattered, we need to understand the relationship between Will and Michelle.
Just you and me and everywhere, running wild, no time to spare. Feel the beat of the street, moving fast on restless feet. Our
It would turn out Michelle did not just have a crush on Will. Michelle and Will had been having an intense affair right in Michelle's house with her husband since 2015, so a full year before Will met Anna. Now, Will had wanted Michelle to leave her husband and be with him, and Michelle had told Will that she wanted the same thing, but she couldn't do it right now. And so to show Will that she was serious, that one day she would be with him, she gave him her wedding ring, which was an emerald stone sitting on a white gold band. It was like a promise ring, that this is my token to you to show you that one day we will be together in public. But as time went on, Michelle didn't really show any signs of trying to leave her husband, and so Will started to wonder if he was just kind of letting his life slip by. Because remember, Will really wanted a wife and kids, and it was starting to look like Michelle was not going to give him either of those things. And so that was why Will went on that dating site and contacted Anna, and then when he learned that Anna wanted a family too, he had asked her to marry him. The ring that Will gave Anna when he proposed to her was the same ring that Michelle had given Will. Her wedding ring, the promise ring. And so when Michelle saw that ring on Anna's finger on a Facebook post that Anna made about having been proposed to by Will, Michelle was enraged. And then, just a few weeks later, when Anna showed up at Michelle's house to move into Will's bedroom with him, she grabbed Will, dragged him to the side of the house, and said, "You need to choose right now between me and Anna." And because Will couldn't come up with an answer, Michelle kicked him and Anna out of the house. However, over the following weeks, despite Michelle having booted them from her property, she could not let go of her jealousy of Anna and her love for Will. And so she sent Anna all these threatening messages on Facebook demanding that she share Will with her or else, and she began incessantly calling and texting Will demanding that he choose her over Anna. And so when Anna saw Will walking around outside chain-smoking cigarettes on the phone, Anna was right in suspecting that that was Michelle that he was talking to. But despite all this pressure, Will just could not make up his mind. He didn't know which woman he wanted to be with more. And so to buy himself some time, he had lied to Anna about hiring an officiant for their wedding on the beach. And then when they arrived on the beach and Will said the officiant had canceled, it was all a ruse. There was never any officiant. He was just trying to buy time for himself. But finally, on April 16th, for whatever reason, Will had decided that he knew which woman he wanted to go with. He wanted to go with Michelle. So he brought Anna out into the woods and he told her the news that he was breaking off the engagement and effectively their relationship was over, at which point Anna turned and stormed off into the woods. And so Will, he watched her disappear and then he turned around and walked back along the path back toward his car. And when he got there, he opened his trunk and got something out of it, and then he walked back along the trail into the woods where he had seen Anna last. And when he reached that spot, he kind of walked off in the direction that Anna had wandered, and eventually he spotted Anna. She was standing in a clearing, looking up into the sky, seemingly lost in thought. And so Will quietly walked up right behind her, and then he raised the shotgun he had gotten out of his trunk. He placed the barrel against the back of Anna's skull, and before she could even react, say something, turn around, do anything, he pulled the trigger. Afterward, he ran back down the trail to his car, and he gathered up all of Anna's things that happened to be inside of the car, along with some trash on the floor of the car, and then he brought all of that stuff back into the woods and kind of dumped it both on and around Anna's body. The next day, a walker and their dog happened to come across Anna's body, and when the police were called out to the site, they began sifting through all of the trash that was kind of scattered around Anna's body. And inside of a crumpled up KFC bag, the police would find a receipt for the day of the murder, and that receipt belonged to Will. The morning after Will killed Anna, he sent those initial text messages to Anna just to cover his tracks. But as he sent them, he actually did feel an enormous sense of regret about the decision he made. He no longer wanted Michelle, he wanted Anna. And it was at that point that he decided he would do what the heroes in some of his favorite movies did. He would go back in time and undo the murder and get his love back. But of course, his efforts would fail. And in January of 2020, 3 years after Anna's murder, Will was sentenced to life in prison. As for Michelle, she was never charged with any crime.